Well, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Lisa Kasatkina. I've known Lisa over half of my life, and this is the second time we've been in a room together. I'm really delighted that she was able to come and present today. Again, I'll just talk over everyone's introduction slides if I keep doing this. So I'll pass over to you now, and you can tell people what you do. But I'm very excited that you're here with us today, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. I've known Mike, as he says, half our lives, but I have only met him in person professionally at these. So I wanted to talk to you all about modern video game QA and kind of how it's changing, what are the challenges and interesting things that we're thinking about there. A bit about myself. This is both me. You may have met me as either Fed or Lisa. Hopefully it's understandable from context which is which. But yeah, I'm a QA craft lead at Jagex, which I'll go on to what any of those things mean in a minute. Okay, we're back. So I am the QA craft lead at Jagex, and I'll go into what both of those things mean, QA, Jagex, etc. But I came into the video game industry also by an odd route. I did ancient and modern history at university and just sort of fell into doing video games. But I've been really enjoying it. I've been doing it for 15 years now. I've tested games and worked on mobile, console, PC. I've never made use of my history knowledge at all. I've tested, my first game was an American football game. I've tested fantasy games, but never anything to do with history. And yeah, in my spare time, I do play video games, but I also play tabletop games, live action role play, board games, and that kind of thing as well. So who are Jagex? What is RuneScape, which is often associated with Jagex? It's possible that some of you may have heard of us. Yeah, it's a Cambridge-based video games developer. It was founded all the way back in 1999, and the name means, and people do often ask this, just means Java gaming experts. Originally, everything was written in Java. This has caused us now, 20 years later, a lot of headaches. But Jagex was responsible for creating the RuneScape franchise. It survived through lots and lots of different changes, lots and lots of different games. But our main thing currently and always really has been community-driven games, things that involve players participating in how we make our games. RuneScape is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. We've talked a little bit about these in previous talks, but this one, RuneScape, has been in continuous development since 2001. So it's really old and possibly a good place to do some video game archaeology. But one of the things that I came in to lead testing on initially, before I became the craft lead, was old school RuneScape, which is a very strange quirk in gaming, where it is a branch of the original game that was developed separately from the currently active main game, branched off in 2013 from a version of the game from 2007, so old even then, and developed with that kind of ethos in mind. So using the old graphics, old style of gameplay, and surprisingly enough, people really enjoy that. And most of our subscribers currently play old school RuneScape. But we also have ambition to make more and different games, all united by the idea of driven by the community involving the players. What is QA? I've already mentioned that a couple of times. It's quality assurance. It's essentially testing video games. That doesn't mean that we sit around and play games all day. We kind of wish that was like that, but even 10, 15 years ago when I was joining the industry, that wasn't possible to do and still effectively test the game. You'll hear it called quality assurance, quality control, quality verification, lots of different things, but it broadly all kind of means the same thing. I've used QA here for convention because that's the most common one. But I like to think of the whole discipline as just quality. We think about like quality. Is it good? Is it the right experience? And to do that, we test the software to understand the quality level. And then we measure it up against something. Sometimes that's an agreed bar that we just all sort of agree amongst ourselves as developers. Sometimes it's some sort of standard or ideal, like a platonic idea of like what would be a good video game. And sometimes it's informed by players, and they kind of tell us what they want, and they set the standards, and we have to try and adhere to that. But the important thing to remember is we don't make the quality happen. We just have a look at it, tell you what it's at, but it's the designers, artists, software engineers who actually do the work to make it good and make it work. We're just there to sort of point out and say, that's bad, change it. So what I want to talk about is how video games have been changing and what that's meant for testing them and making sure that they live up to the standards that we set, that our players set, and why that's becoming interesting and challenging in the modern era. My idea is that actually everyone plays games, and they have for a long time, but who here, hands up, has ever played solitaire on a desktop, on anything? Lots of you. It's just something that you do when you're bored, and that's the game that comes default with Windows, and it has for like 3 decades, 2 decades, however long Windows has been around. Lots of different people play games, and now that you have a smartphone in your pocket, everyone has access to a gaming machine, or a lot of people have access to a gaming machine, and everyone's got time to spend to play it in some way. So the audience, the gaming audience, has just grown and grown. And it's not always, the most obvious things. It's not necessarily the AAA games. It's your average match 3 game that you play on your smartphone. Mobiles have always been around. Some of the older people here probably remember playing Snake on a Nokia phone. But the explosion of smartphones obviously has kind of exponentially changed that. Gaming on the go is really, really, really common. You've obviously got things like the Nintendo Switch, which is just as happy connected up at home as a console to your TV, as it is on a train or somewhere else. And the Steam Deck, more recently, has kind of taken PC gaming, which is very traditionally the sort of thing that you do maybe at like a desktop on a chair at home. But the Steam Deck, a handheld version of that, has taken that to the train, the airplane, wherever else. But lots of people still do play on consoles and PCs on their sofa and wherever else. So it's lots and lots of different formats that we potentially have to think about when testing. There's also a huge variety of games available for different times and sessions, something that you play for 5 minutes, something that you play for hours, and for different levels of skill. So, for example, there are now lots and lots of modern card games that are still really popular, but a little bit more complex than solitaire. Especially relevant to all of this, for good or for ill, lots of games are expected to be played for a long time, not just in one session, but over years and years, you get engaged in one game. And so players are sort of craving more content, more stuff for their favorite game. At Jagex, this happens to be our bread and butter. As I said, RuneScape has been running since 2001, and we've just built and built on that. And it's what we internally call forever games, because we expect them to sort of just continue lasting until people get bored. And they haven't yet, so that's good. But what that means for lots of other games, not just massively multiplayer online games or anything like that, is that a lot more often, whether on consoles, on smartphones, games are in development after they hit release 1.0, a lot more than they were ever in development ahead of that time. And even with longer game development periods, you hear about multiple years, like over half a decade for some, it could potentially still last even longer after it's initially released. Games are a lot more complex. They're built by huge teams, some of the big games by development teams of over 1,000 people, all working together to produce a game. And that means there's a lot of complexity involved. So that's kind of the environment that we're in, and that means there are lots and lots of challenges for testing. How do we test them when games are getting bigger, when lots more players are playing them and having lots and lots of different expectations? So here are the things that are the challenges that we see and experience right now. We have large communities. They're really diverse. They all have a voice. And we kind of have to try and listen to that. We have to try and connect with them. They know the game better than we do often because they play it for a long time and for a lot. We calculated for a project that we're currently working on and working on to release that in the alpha stage, at the maximum level of the alpha stage, of the number of people that we expect playing the game, in one day, players are going to play the game for more hours, 100 times more hours, than any testing that we did in the run-up to that point. So immediately on just that one day, collectively, the player base will have more experience, have seen more of the game than we ever had and we ever could before that. So there is worth in listening to them, but it can be quite difficult. They'll experience situations that we never will and we never have because of that. Yeah, that just adds to the complexity. A growing part of all of this is accessibility needs and trying to understand those. With a wider player base, this becomes a lot more important, and we have to take that into account. Games have actually been kind of underserved in this area for a long time. So the industry is getting better, but there's a lot of work to do. And it's more than just, you might think of like color blindness options, but there's all kinds of visual, audio, control things that we have to think about, and anticipate and learn and understand what are the things that people need. We fundamentally don't want to block off access and enjoyment of our games, so we have to try and find a way to build that in. Because games are bigger and go on and last for a long time, multiple years, they're more complex and more demanding. Even simpler mobile games can have lots and lots of different systems interacting. It's not just about the gameplay that you experience. There are systems involved and built to serve art, graphics, sound, networking if you're playing with other players or you're just getting involved in them and somehow bringing them into your game, like playing leaderboards against your friends, user interface. All of these things we have to test in isolation, but we also have to test how they all work together, and they sometimes don't. So the example that I dug up last night at searching through our bug databases at midnight was we were actually testing accessibility options for a game and adding new ones to an older game. One of the options was to turn everything into grayscale to make the contrast between elements better, and another one was to highlight items that players could interact with or click on. And they'd been tested and they all worked fine. But in certain locations, if you used both of those options together, after a short while, the game would crash. And we couldn't work out why. And the developers had come back, well, they placed safeguards to prevent that from happening, and they tested them, and they prevented the crashes from happening. But what we discovered was someone had wrote an exception to the safeguards to stop the safeguards running on one of those modes, the highlighting, so that the mode would actually work. And so it meant that and on its own, it did work, it didn't need the safeguard. But if ever both those modes were enabled, the game would crash. And so that's how the bug came up. Very hard to anticipate and understand what's going on, even when you've tested it and you can go, yeah, it does crash, even though it shouldn't. So, modern problems require modern solutions. Lots and lots of testers have been thinking about this in lots of different companies over years and years, and we do talk about this and try and share ideas and kind of come up with new ways. Sorry, excuse me. New ways of doing things. So, having identified some of these challenges and problems, what are some of the ways that we're trying to solve them, and how is that changing how we do testing, especially compared to how it was done very manually 10, 15, 20 years ago? With these bigger games, we can't really necessarily do everything by hand. We can't just sit down and play the game, because some of these games take 30, 40, 50 hours to complete. And that's just to complete a part of them. That's not to experience everything in all the different permutations. You'd need a lot of testers over a very long time. And as we know, the players will still play the game more than you by lots of measures. So, what are some of the things that we've been trying to do? We ask the players for feedback. We ask and they answer. And they tell us a lot of things over time, constantly. But it's not always directly useful because they're not professional testers. So we have to work out ways that we can hear them. Some of the things that we're trying to do is to use LLMs. And Tommy, I think, talked a little bit about LLMs being good for searching out information. And so that's what we're trying to do by feeding in lots and lots of reports for players to try and collate that information and to essentially pull together, well, okay, how many times are people mentioning a particular problem? How does that compare against another problem that people are mentioning? Which of these is more common? Which of these is more important? Like, which ones do players talk more excitedly or more frustratingly about that they're experiencing? We're trying to use things like these to help us understand and prioritize what's actually affecting the experience for players, and hopefully then how we can, what we should be prioritizing to fix. Yeah, there's other uses for that, condensing really wordy or complex reports just down to the steps that are needed to understand what's gone wrong. And one of the other things, perhaps the unexpected thing that we face is lots of abuse. People are frustrated, their game isn't working. But if you're a tester and you're having to manually read all of these reports, it can get really, really difficult being called abusive words every other report. We can use the LLM to strip those out and leave just the useful parts, hopefully, and still resolve people's frustrations and problems. We can test for accessibility. We can build that in to some extent, so you can design with accessibility in mind. If you're creating a game from new, you can put in lots of different control options. You can put lots of user interface options, like the color blindness options, different font texts and sizes, and so on. But that's harder to do if the game is really old and you're trying to retrofit all of that. You're going to be missing things. You're going to be missing ways that the game is still not accessible or not doing too well. So we have been trying to build tools that essentially help us to check these things. Our old method, even when I joined Jagex on one of the teams, was to go and run to the developer who was colorblind and ask them to look a particular design and say if it was good or not. But yeah, ModEd got really, really tired of that, so we developed a tool to replace him and let him do his designing in peace. Automation is and has always been a big thing in software testing for the last, I don't know, a very long time, ever since I joined the industry, certainly. And that's comparatively easy to do in software because you're dealing with ready-made tools and you're dealing with comparatively limited scenarios. Games have, as I've written here, stuff. They have a lot of bits to them. But we talked about all the different areas, the graphics, the audio, but you also have the subjective elements like fun and balance. How do you automate that? A machine can't really tell you if a game is fun. It sometimes can't even tell you if it's actually balanced because the way that people play games and enjoy games is really, really subjective. So we have to think about what can we automate? What can we sort of reduce to the simple elements? And what do we have to go in and still assess and manually test by hand? And alongside automation, we also want to help our testers do that sort of by hand testing. So there's two concepts. There's exploratory testing and destructive testing. Exploratory testing is basically where you go in and play a specific area of the game, sort of like a normal person, but in lots of different ways, so like lots of normal people, and try and figure out ways that, people might play it and things might not work. And then there's destructive testing, which is you try really hard to break it. You hit all the buttons in really weird combinations. You do unexpected actions, move your character butting in against a wall in a particular area. You try all of these things in the hopes of finding ways that the game will break and hopefully tell you why that's a problem and fix things in a way that will stop it breaking in those ways. But we're, as humans, really bad at memory, so sometimes you forget what you've actually done to cause the crash or the problem to happen. So we've been looking at assisting tools that record test sessions, but go further than that, not just recording what's happening in the game, but transcribing the audio so you can say and comment to yourself. That's recording the controls input, so you know which keys you pressed just before the game crashed. So you can sort of devote all of your brain time to creatively breaking the game and trying out all the combinations, and then refer back to, okay, this is what I actually did to cause the problem to happen. And finally, we get a lot of information just from us doing the testing, let alone if we involve players. And it's really hard to process and make sense of raw data. We can look at just one bug report that says something is wrong and make sense of that. But when we're reporting lots and lots of these bugs, it can be hard to make sense of it. Even modern bug databases compared to when I started 15 years ago can't tell you holistically kind of the trends and everything that's going on because you're dealing with thousands and thousands of bugs over multiple years, some that may have been discovered by testers who haven't been at the company for some time and played a version of the game that is unrecognizable from what it is now. So we have to try and process that data to understand the trends. And that means going and working with data scientists or becoming data scientists ourselves to try and learn what the different patterns look like in this data and to sort of identify hotspots like, okay, we try our hardest, but this level or this map in a particular game just always has lots of problems and issues, whatever we do to it. So do we need to massively change it or rework it or spend extra time working on that? We don't have to imagine these things. We can just look at the data and what we're finding. So, in conclusion, with lots and lots of people, more people than ever, playing games in lots of different ways, we have a lot more data, both from players and internally from complex, long-running games to deal with. And so QA is changing. We increasingly can't rely on just looking at the game. We have to try and make sense of it on a bigger scale. And that's, I think, why QA remains fun and interesting to this day. Thank you very much.
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much. I think we've got time for one quick question before we break. Yeah, let me run around.
Thank you very much. Lovely presentation. This was a question that's similar to this. I was going to ask Dr. Thompson, but I think actually much better to ask yourself. I don't know if it's a question or just a statement that you don't need a bigger boat, you need many more boats, I think. In the context of AI, the black box kind of problem of what it might introduce into the context, and the very, very recent case with character.ai, I don't know if you've come across that news yet, but very harrowing story with how a chatbot interaction with a user led to quite a tragic case. How do you see the role of kind of gaming and QA in what AI and the future of AI and gaming might introduce into this whole notion of addictivity into games and where it might lead its users? And is that something you're actively looking at?
That's a really good and difficult question. As you've alluded to, sort of the black boxes, we already deal with a lot of black boxes in how some of the ways that the games are built and the systems that are there that we have to try and test and work out how they're intending to work. And AI potentially is like the biggest black box in that sense, and undiscernible box. Sometimes the way that I think about it, and this is kind of early thoughts, because no, currently it's not something that like we're actively developing, for example. So it's not on the cards for us to try and test. But I always think of it like, if we don't know what the intended outcome is, it's very hard for us to test to that. So if we don't know what the AI, the machine, is trying to do, we can't say if it's doing it right or not. And I think that's going to be the big challenge, which is it doing anything intentional, or is it just random? And then we as testers can't really say anything, because it's like, it's doing its thing, I guess.
Lisa and I are hoping to do some work together, maybe at some point, to have a look at some of those questions. So it's an interesting topic to bring up. Thank you so much. If we could thank Lisa again for that wonderful talk.
Thank you.